case. And then I also took part in the UI Tech X last year. Had a great time.
Hi guys, I'm Anna and I'm the Vice President of Competitions for MCG. And I've been working with both Eamon and Garrett, and I'm really excited to see their workshop today. I think it's going to be really helpful.
Yep, and I'm Josh. I'm the president, and I'm also excited to see what they got.
All right, so we'll just get it kicked off. So this is for the implementation and then also the risks and mitigation workshop. So hopefully everybody is in the right place. And then just to confirm, if you haven't already, please either scan the QR code or fill out or just, put in the URL so we can kind of just judge attendance. So today we're just going to be going over 4 components of like implementations and risk and mitigations for a case and to make them as comprehensive as possible. So I'll be going over the research and then passing it off to Eamon for implementation. And I'll be explaining the risks, and then Eamon will be taking some of the mitigations for it. So starting off with research for implementation and risks, there are 3 kind of main components. The first is just like gathering. So kind of the starting stage that a lot of you guys can begin as soon as possible is just reading over the case. So if you haven't already, no worries. I know the launch was yesterday. And if you already have read the case, that's fantastic. So obviously you guys are doing it about Apple Music. And Apple is just a really interesting company, great tech company, a lot of cool competitors like Spotify and Tidal and all these other streaming services. So you really want to just start gathering kind of some like basic information, or at least some links or some other like websites or resources that you think you're going to then, go into that next step and actually research. So that type of research is going to be looking into Apple as a company and kind of their inner workings, thinking about it from like an implementation as well as a risks and mitigation standpoint, and kind of looking at their infrastructure and like what you could find that would then help you determine how they're going to roll out each of your recommendations. And then you also just kind of want to look at your recommendations as a whole and kind of break them down a little bit step by step. And that's just like a preliminary way to think about actually putting together some form of implementations, but then also kind of preparing you for developing your risks and mitigations. Then it's also great just to look at other companies and look at competitors in the industry as a whole. So if you're recommending that Apple Music have more of a social aspect like Spotify, you could look at how Spotify rolled that out and their processes, and maybe some of the risks that they had to face, or some of the features that they tried but didn't really work that well, and then what they did to kind of fix that. And then lastly, you'll be looking at just analyzing all of your information. So first, one of the really important things is just the feasibility of implementation, and just implementation in general. Like, it's something that is very important if it's not a strong part of your presentation, if that makes sense. So you want to make sure that just implementation in general, you're not rolling out a whole new product line in like a span of a couple months. So you really want to make sure that you're combining all the information that you already have to put out a timeline that is representative of how a company like Apple would do something, or how similar companies, its competitors, would do something. And then you always want to make sure that your research is able to support your implementation plan, as well as maybe some of these future mitigations. And it really just shows as a whole how you've considered your recommendations in your whole case in the context of the industry and in Apple Music, and especially Apple as a whole. So I'll now pass it off to Eamon just to take some of the implementation specifics.
Yeah, so now we're just going to go over like the implementation plan and what to look for, and basically what in your implementation slide in your deck. So basically what your implementation plan should be is kind of a very detailed breakdown of what your recommendations are. So this would be short-term and long-term, and it's basically going over, let's say in your recommendation, last year I recommended putting in new infrastructure for ordering at McDonald's. You're going to want to go into like the cost, the predicted revenues, like how long this is going to take in every step of the way that's going to go in order to get this accomplished in a timely manner. So this could, as I said, this is going to include like a short and long-term breakdown of what's going to happen. You want to show this breakdown in time and kind of either like quarters, months, years. So maybe Q1 of 2022 would be something that you guys would look at. And then you're also going to want to look at like the expected difficulties and risks associated with this, which we'll get on later. And then one thing like I did last year is when you're implementing like infrastructure, if you have one of your recommendations, you always want to kind of recommend in the future to look back on this recommendation and kind of assess if it was valid, or assess the technology and kind of have maintenance of this. So for last year, for my Tech X, we recommended the infrastructure. and it was kind of, okay, every like 6 months, we're going to go in and we're going to make sure that the technology is working correctly. And we're going to have this team here to do regular check-ins every like 3 months. Then you want to make sure that your implementation is impactful, relevant, and feasible. So for impactful, you want to make sure it's having enough of a significant impact on the company itself. So for such a big company such as Apple, like a small recommendation that really doesn't have too big of an impact on their revenue isn't going to be something that they're really going to look for. It also needs to be relevant to like the time and to the industry and what Apple needs. So you don't want to recommend something that Apple's already done or something that Apple has done that like the competitors already have. Maybe it's something based off what a competitor has, but you want to give Apple a little bit of an edge so that it is remains competitive. And then finally, you want it to be feasible. So say you're building, let's say like a brand new factory for Tesla. You don't want to say, okay, we're going to build like a mega factory in Germany in 1 month, because that's just not feasible. And the judges are going to like kind of see that and be like, okay, like you didn't really think about it too detailed. And then for the research, you want to include ideology such as like Porter's 5 forces, which looks at more of the competitive atmosphere of like the industry. But that's not really probably as important as you want to look at like just competitors themselves. So say like, okay, with Apple Music, you want to look at like Spotify, Pandora, and all those different companies and kind of see what they've done in the past and then improve upon that and also improve upon Apple. Like here it says that Burger King and McDonald's be somewhat similar. So like we said with Spotify and Apple Music. And then you want to like dissect each recommendation and implementation into milestones, as we said earlier. So like you can do Q1 and then Q2 have 2 different segments. So maybe like install, train employees, and so on and so on. And we'll get into more detail on the next slide. So then with this, it kind of shows 3 possibilities for how you can have your implementation slide. The first is a Gantt chart, which is probably the most aesthetically pleasing out of all of these. However, it is somewhat difficult to show the more detailed and have text on there to kind of say what it is. So it's a great way to go in your appendix and kind of show, okay, this is like the more detailed version, because you can go month by month rather than just naming Q1 2020 as it does in the classic timeline. So the second classic timeline, or arrows, is great because it kind of shows that it goes from the past to the present to the future. It is aesthetically pleasing, and this is probably one of the better ones that you could actually use in your slide deck, just because it is really easy to understand and there's a decent amount of detail that you can get on there. The only problem is it's not as detailed in terms of like the timeliness of it. So it just says on this one, it says Q2 2019, which is a lot longer than that's like three months. So it's not as specific as compared to the Gantt chart. And then finally, the table. So this is a good one also for your appendix, but you could also use it in your slides. You have a lot of like room here to work with and put a lot of different detail in terms of like the duration, the start date, and the end date. So it's a great way to go in your appendix. And when judges ask questions about, okay, like, can you give me a little more information on this recommendation and implementation of this? You can say, okay, we're going to start November 19th. It will end November 20th. And it will be a 1-year duration. It is like these are all 3 different possibilities, but like I said, the Gantt chart and the table are probably best for the appendix, and the classic timeline would be good for your actual presentation. And then here we're just going to go into a little like example. So we can walk through this with you guys. If you guys want to participate, that'd be great. We really appreciate that. So a popular deli in a small town is looking to expand to capture growing demand. Since their deli has developed a strong brand, they're thinking of opening a pizza place sister location to diversify their offerings. Your team assessed the idea and are recommending the expansion. How would you implement this expansion while considering the risks and goals of the client? So we'd recommend these following steps for this process. So be sure to consider the specific steps necessary to make this happen. Then you want to research how long each step in the implementation would take. And finally, order the steps and create a visual representing your implementation. So can you guys first think of like any specific steps that would be necessary in order to open up a sister location in the same town? If any of you guys just want to unmute and like say them, please feel free. No one? Okay. So we can go on to the next slide where we have a few of them that we thought of. So on here, this is the first step, obviously. So these are some necessary steps that might be able to, that you need to happen. So securing funds, like how would you raise the money? This would probably go more into financials, just because sometimes in the implementation slide itself, you're not really going to go in detail on the actual financial impact. Then you would go into maybe researching and choosing the property location, finally purchasing the property, And then something that like a lot of people actually sometimes miss out on would be like hiring and training new workers, or just the smaller steps, which are kind of behind the scenes and not actually something that you'll see. Like you're going to see purchasing the property, you're going to see you're going to see them building the building, but you're not really going to see like hiring and training of new workers. It's not something that is out there publicly. Yeah, so these are just some of the many ones that you could think of. And then here's steps 2 and 3. So this is, you can see it's in a graphic, which looks nice. This is the table graph. So it's a little more detailed. It's not as aesthetically pleasing as something like the Gantt chart or the classic like arrow. But one like negative about this is right here in this one, it's not really showing the financial impacts, which we said is something that is pretty typical with some timelines. But if you want to go like above and beyond, you can include a little bit more about your financial plans in your implementation. However, with a company like Apple, it's probably not going to be a big deal to go and raise several $1 million to kind of recommend something new for Apple Music. Now I'm going to pass it off to, I believe, Garrett for risks.
Awesome. And then just to like quickly kind of reiterate something that Eamon was saying that I think is super important about the implementation plan is that having a really good implementation plan really shows the judges and demonstrates to the judges that you as like a team have a really good understanding of like the case and just kind of like business and like the different industries as a whole. So it's really important that you're kind of using all of the steps that Eamon, just spoke about and like really taking kind of like the implementation plan like seriously. Like don't spend like too much time on it, but just make sure that, like Eamon said, you're creating the steps and then researching and then, making some form of graphic. And then kind of, shifting forward just to the different risks, you want to make sure that these risks are a little bit more unique, right? There are going to be so many different teams and so many different risks that all the judges are seeing. So you kind of want to stay from the classic, like, oh, it's going to cost too much. There might not be a lot of revenue, investors might not be interested, and really try to break it down into these like 4 different, I would say like types of risks that we've identified. So the first is just like the technical considerations. So technology is kind of always changing. So especially with Apple Music, which exists, on an iPhone, if you're recommending something specific for that, in a couple of years, the technology might totally change. And then for internal, external impact, that's talking more about, training and having employees who are able to carry out the recommendations of the implementation, as well as, if you're thinking about having a partnership, like you want Apple Music to partner with specific musicians, you want to make sure that there aren't any language or cultural barriers, or you can identify those as a risk, and then you have some form of mitigation for that. And then as well as any federal regulations. So it might be a good idea just to look in some like technology law if your recommendation kind of touches on something like that, as well as, like data laws, because those are a lot more prevalent. And it's just a lot harder for big companies to kind of jump through all those data hoops. Just make sure that that is also something you're considering. And then lastly, just like social reactions. So if you want Apple Music, if you wouldn't want to recommend them just like selling off a large portion of their stock, or like selling part of their patents or whatever intellectual property to Spotify, because that doesn't have a great brand image, and you probably will not have any mitigation that'll like cover that well and make sense for the judges. And then always just make sure that whenever you're thinking of a risk, that you're thinking of the risk first and then the mitigation, and then not working backwards. And then just moving in on like assigning impact. So something that's really common is this little, I guess, graphic called a risk matrix. So you can build it. I know when I've made them in the past, I've just built them in Excel, and it's really easy just, to color the cells. So you have probability on the y-axis, and then impact on the x-axis. And then you kind of just shade in the different areas. So green is a low level risk. Those are, some solid, if the risks aren't that high probability, not that high of impact, it's pretty solid. Yellow is like a medium risk. So maybe 1 or 2 of your risks. And then red is like the higher critical risk. That's at like the higher end of like probability and the higher end of impact. So for something like that, if you find yourself, generating a risk that lies in this red area, you may want to kind of rethink the recommendation just as a whole to minimize the risk, or think of, a really, really strong mitigation. Because if you're saying that one of your recommendations has a really, really high probability of being very, very hurtful to Apple as like a real world application, Apple, probably won't want to hear this idea or implement it. So just some of the factors you want to take into consideration when making this kind of matrix is just the cost of the company. So the initial effect on profit. So not, having Apple spend like billions of dollars in like the first quarter or anything, as well as the ease just to bounce back from this risk and then just, mitigate it as a whole, as well as any technical performance impact. So, Apple's a technology company, just think of those risks. And then also whether or not the company is able to function if the recommendation doesn't pan out. It's like for Apple Music, at the very basis, it's a music streaming platform. So if any of your recommendations, any of those risks generated kind of threatens Apple Music's ability just to allow people to stream music, definitely something to reconsider, just take another look at. Now I'll pass it back off to Eamon to take some of the mitigations.
Yep. So like Garrett said, first you want to identify the key risks that might come up with your recommendations, and then you want to kind of recommend some mitigations that you think could combat these risks if they were to come into reality. So this is kind of like, as it says here, it's your last chance to kind of go over anything that you want to cover in your deck. It's a great way to kind of, let's say a judge, you recommended something and they thought of that risk and then you identified that risk before. It's a great way to answer one of their questions already if you can really develop like a high level risk and mitigation. It's a great way to leave it off on a great ending as well. So here's an example of kind of a good mitigation strategy. So the recommendation here is like create Under Armour flagship stores in China to increase brand recognition. The risk is like original unpopularity of flagship stores when opened. And then finally, the mitigation is to use already one of their pre-established athletic partnerships to kind of attract customers in that region. So this is a good risk because it's something that Under Armour already has in their possession. So it's not something they need to go and reinvest in. Another example of like a risk could be something along the lines, let's say, because we're looking at a tech company, there's a lot of risks associated with like hacking and like access to like details and data. So a good way to do that is kind of just recommend something along the lines of like stronger security or data guidelines in place there. I think we can go to the next slide. So here, like with the example of the pizza thing that we went over earlier. So what some of the risks here could be customers in the area don't prefer pizza. So this is probably a really low probability. I don't know too many people who don't really like pizza, but it does have a really high impact. So it's something that you could recommend, like this would be a good recommendation still because it's a very low probability and there's a really low chance it would happen. The second risk would be like running two restaurants can dilute the original's quality. So this is a high probability, but it has a medium impact. And then to mitigate this, you could hire enough staff and promote, select people to kind of balance both. So to make sure that one store isn't isn't worse off than the other. And then finally, the third would be inefficient communication between restaurants. So this is probably like one of the ones that you want to aim to have. You probably want to aim to have like mainly like medium probability and lower impact or medium impact. Maybe like one high just to show that you thought of that, or one low, however you want to do it. But like the mitigation here would be implement like a POS system to integrate technology across both locations. So this really just enable like both places to communicate efficiently. So here's just some examples, but like there are plenty of different risks and mitigations out there. And like I said, you really want to develop some that will kind of lead the judges, like answer some of their questions that they might have. So when you really think of like a risk and mitigation, make sure to like go into the judge's shoes a little bit and kind of think from their perspective. Like if someone was presenting this to you, what would you think would be the first questions, or what would you think would be like the first obstacles and getting this recommendation, like implementing this recommendation, and then you want to tackle it that way. So I think that's all we have. If you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And for anyone who joined late,